The title of the message today is The Short Straw. Or, as an afterthought, maybe 3 little pigs are still 3 little pigs. I know your mama told you that there was one smart pig, but I think we can prove today from the Torah that even the pig with the brick house had a problem when it comes down to the final judgment. You know, the problem sometimes when you prepare a message from the Torah is hearing with sensitivity what the Ruach wants to say to this specific congregation on this specific Shabbat that supersedes all the other wonderful messages that we could possibly draw out of that Torah portion. But I think it was easy this time to pick out the message or at least the topic of study, because we know if when we study, if we see a word that's repeated one time, or if it appears maybe 2 or 3 times within the portion, then it's a flashing red light. It says, stop and look at me and explain me because I mean something significant. In the Torah portion today, the word straw, teven, appeared 8 times. Now, if something appears 8 times, it's screaming, stop and look at me. I need you to stop and look at me because I'm telling you something. Now, it was a lot easier to identify the word that we needed to look at than to figure out what exactly it was saying to this congregation, at least. So what we're going to do is what I always do when I'm not really sure what to do. We start back at the beginning and we just apply some very simple rules of biblical interpretation. Now, Jimmy's taught you a little bit about the rule of first mention, and we've used that before. And I've talked to you a little bit about a Jewish method of interpretation where we take one verse, and that verse becomes the father verse. In other words, from this father verse, we're going to build our understanding. We'll build from that as the foundation. And eventually we'll have, hopefully, a pretty complete picture of what that word or what that verse might say to us. That's the only solution I have when the answers aren't obvious, and often they're not that obvious to me. But what we need to do today is look at this straw and ask ourselves, are we drawing the short straw in our walk with Messiah? We are not intended to draw the short straw because He's given us all the precious stones and materials we need to build this temple. But I think for a long time, many of us settled for the short straws. So starting at the beginning, what we want to do is apply that rule of first mention. And what we want to do is look for the first mention of straw. And I think what confused me at first is actually there's 2 different meanings of straw that will be defined for us. And that's why I was getting confused as I took all the verses that had to do with straw and tried to figure out what they were saying. What I finally realized, we're given 2 definitions of straw. Straw as it's first mentioned, as it was created to be, is found in Bereshit. Remember when Eliezer goes to Laban's house, he's looking for a wife for Yitzhak. And Laban says, we have straw for your camels. Twice in that context we see the word straw first appear in Scripture. So we know that the proper use for straw, as found in Bereshit, is fodder for camels, beasts of burden, dumb animals. That's what it was created for. But now that we're into Shemot,
what we see is a completely different meaning of straw. What we're going to see that there is a man-made, there is a false use of straw that the Father never intended for us, because we see the Hebrews being forced to make bricks and to gather their own straw in order to make these bricks. This is going to be the false or the man-made application of straw. Now, interestingly, it's at Laban's house that we had the first mention of straw in Scripture. And twice he says, I have fodder, I have straw for your camels. Now we know that Laban goes back to the Hebrew word for white, and we've made some applications there before. But if you look into your concordance, or if you look it up in your Hebrew dictionary, there's another meaning for Laban other than to make something white. The other meaning for Laban is to make bricks. That's very interesting. That's Strong's number 3835 if you want to check it. But we know that when later Yaakov goes back to Laban's house, what he does is he enters a refining fire. He becomes a brick maker, so to speak, for Laban, because what he's dealing with in Laban's house is not only falsehood, lies, deception. He's also being cheated habitually by his uncle Laban. He's always changing his wages, changing the conditions of his work. He's trying to cheat Yaakov of the blessings that the Father has given him. So what he's doing, in essence, is a foreshadowing of what will come later for his descendants, the children of Israel, who are making bricks for Paro. In essence, Yaakov is making bricks for Laban. He's serving Laban, who's trying to cheat him and make him subservient. But he's delivered from that. He's delivered from the land of Aram, and he returns to the land that is promised to his fathers. He's delivered from that hard labor. That was his Ramses and his Pitom experience. Ramses and Pitom were the storehouse cities that the Israelites were commanded to build for Pharaoh. So Yaakov also was delivered from his brick-making experiences. But the taskmasters in our lives, the Pharaohs and the Labans, will demand very hard labor from us, in which they derive the profits, not us. Now, if the Father has his hands on us, obviously he knows how to deliver us out of the hands of the Pharaohs and the Lavans, who want us to make their bricks. But it's in this place at Laban's house, the first mention of straw is at Laban's house, that Yaakov endures that period, remember, that we called Bina, when we studied the levels of intelligence, Chokhmah, Bina, and Da'at. Remember that middle section of instruction and learning was the hardest, because Lavan, remember, begins with Lamed, teaching and instruction, the ox goad. Remember we said this is the longest period that Yosef endured, where he's constantly being prodded with the ox goad so that he can mature, come to maturity. That's the part that we must not despise, because it seems to last forever and it hurts a lot sometimes when you're being poked and pulled back onto the path through the ox goad of instruction. It's unpleasant. But we're told not to despise that period of Bina, that time of learning to connect the dots, because that's what Yaakov had to endure before he could wrestle and become Yisrael. That's a process we go through. And as we build this understanding, let's also look at a connecting passage in Bereshit. As Laban's name alludes to brick making, let's go back and find the first mention of bricks as well. Maybe there's a connection there. The first mention of bricks is also found in Bereshit, and it's at the building of the Tower of Babel. And it says something really interesting in that passage, that when the people decided to build this tower, to build a name for themselves that would reach up into the heavens, in the plain of Shinar, it says that they took brick for stones. Now that's interesting. If you've seen pictures of that area, there's no shortage of stones. So if they wanted stones, why didn't they use stones? If the message is simply that they took bricks and built a tower, why doesn't it just say they took bricks and built a tower? But no, the wording is very specific. It says they took bricks in place of stones. Why does it say that? Well, it goes on to say that they purpose to bake them thoroughly, to make them hard. That's interesting in itself. They're going to bake them at a very high heat in order to make them hard, to make them part of this tower. But what these bricks were, if you read it in context, were a substitute. They were a man-made, manufactured substitute for rocks. Now, we've studied the rocks before, but I want to refresh your memory. When you look at the word for rock, or one of the Hebrew words for rock, the word is Evan, and I've written it on the board for you. Aleph, Veit, Nun, Sofit. Evan. Now we know that the Aleph, the first letter of Evan, or rock, stands for El, or Elohim, which is the creative aspect of God. Bereshit bara Elohim, in the beginning, created God, created Elohim. It's talking to you and speaking to you of His creative aspect of His nature. We know that He has many names, but this is the first name you're given, and the Aleph stands for that part of His aspect, His nature. Now, if we look at the first two letters, we see that it spells by itself Av, Father. Or if we take the Aleph away, we see that it spells Ben, Son. The Aleph, Veit, Nun, Evan, the rock, is composed of the Father and the Son united in the Veit, which stands for the temple. Because the Son is the mediator for us in the temple to the Father. To the sons of Israel, the Son is the mediator. See it there in the middle, in the temple, to the Father. So you can see why we were commanded, if we built an altar, not to use a tool upon the stones. We were not to split the stones or to shape them in order to build an altar. Why? It would be a manufactured substitute for that creative aspect of God that we worship. You cannot split the Father from the Son, because He is echad, He is one. There is no way that you can split that and worship it. That becomes idolatry. So the rock represents the unity of the Father and the Son. And the middle, the Veit, the temple, Habayit, the house, that is where our unity with the sons of Israel occurs. But in this case, we can see that the intelligent creative force of the Father, the Aleph, must precede the work of the Son. Av, Ben, Father, Son. There first had to be a creative intelligence before the word of creation could come forth. You have to think a thought before you can speak it. Well, some of us don't. We speak before we think. But ideally, we think before we speak, so that what we create with those words is something good and wholesome and pure and holy. So we can see that this trip that Yaakov took to Aram is foreshadowing what happened to his descendants in another way. You see, Pitom and Ramses were both storehouse cities. If we remember what we read in the previous Torah portion, both of these cities that the Israelites were commanded to build were specifically called storehouse cities. There's no idle words. If it just wanted you to know that they were building cities, it would have said cities. But it wants you to know they were building storehouse cities, because there's things that you should know about the storehouse cities. Later, when the written Torah is given, we know that the storehouse cities were set aside for the Levites. The tithes would come into the storehouse, and from there the Levites would gain their sustenance so that they could serve in Habayit, in the temple, to the people. Also from these storehouse cities, the Levites would distribute food to the poor. If you were in poor circumstances, the Levites would take care of you as well. two real purposes for a storehouse: to keep the Levitical priesthood functioning so that there may be bread in my house, and to bring a subsistence to the poor in that district of that storehouse city. Now what we see is something much different. Paro sends the Hebrews to steal straw throughout Egypt. It says that they scattered throughout Egypt in order to find this straw. It wasn't theirs to take. But nevertheless, they were sent out to collect straw in order to make their bricks. Now, if you'll remember, not too far back, Yosef, as he worked for a previous Pharaoh, acquired all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, except for the land that was owned by the priests of Egypt. The religious leaders of Egypt, those who were part of that religious system, they kept their property. But the common person, the common farmer, they had lost their land. Now, generations later, we're still going to see the effects of tenant farming. Economic effects don't disappear overnight. So these Egyptian farmers need their straw just as much as Paro did. Now, when we see that Yaakov set out for Laban's house years earlier, he stopped for the night at a certain place, Hamakom. And we know that later at the Temple Mount, it was later the Temple Mount, but in this place where he stopped for the night, he took a stone, he took an oven, and he made a pillow out of it. And then he dreamed that he was asleep at the gateway of heaven, and indeed he was sleeping on the future Temple Mount. He saw angels ascending and descending into heaven. And it's in this same place that the same promise that was promised to Abraham, that was promised to Yitzhak, is now promised to Yaakov, that his descendants would be numerous, that he would inherit the land that he was lying on, and through his descendants all the families of the world would be blessed. And then Yaakov takes this oven, pours oil on it, he anoints it, and at this point he vows to give a tithe of all that God gives him. If he will protect him and keep him and bring him home safely, he says, I will give a tithe. I will bring a tithe into your storehouse. So we know that the genuine temple, not the storehouse cities of Pithom and Ramses, not the house of Laban, not the Tower of Babel, the genuine house, the genuine structure built to honor the name, is going to be built in this certain place, and it's going to be made upon an oath of stone, not an oath of brick, not an oath of straw, not an oath of wood. Wood, hay, stubble, that's not our destiny. Our destiny is made and was vowed upon an oath of rock that cannot be divided. Now, Pharaoh uses straw, he uses tevin. You see how these words have the same second two letters, but they have different first letters? Evan starting with Aleph, which is symbolic of the creative aspect of God. Lavan, referring to a teaching and learning period, a refining fire that Yaakov went through. And now we're down to tevin, which is the word for straw or for chaff. This is what Pharaoh uses to build his storehouse. You see, that tithe that Yaakov promised to bring was upon an oath of stone. The tithes that are coming into Pharaoh's house have a much different purpose behind them. They are not for the sake of the poor. A Levitical city, a Levitical storehouse is for the sake of the poor and the Levite. The cities that Pharaoh is building are for himself. It is to sustain his political, economic, and religious system and to make his own kingdom stronger. It's a monument to himself, not a monument to the name of Elohim. Those storehouses were built through oppression and through theft. In the house of Elohim, we bring our tithes and our offerings into the storehouse because we love him, Because we want to be obedient to Him. Because we want to perpetuate the holiness of the temple. And we want the poor to be fed. Completely different motivations for building the storehouse city. Do you know that straw, if we read the Mishnah, straw is not even required for a tithe. Once you separate out the grain is considered clean, and you bring a tithe of the grain. But the straw itself is not clean. In other words, it's not clean to qualify as a tithe. You don't bring it. You throw it to the animals. You don't worry about tithing off of the straw. The Egyptians that were having the straw taken from them did not even owe that straw to a storehouse city. They didn't owe it. So what is the difference between straw, tevin, and a rock, evan? Well, tevin, you see, begins with the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet. It starts at the end. Tevin. The end cannot precede the beginning, even though he declares from the end. It cannot precede the beginning. That is not his way. He has a set order of things. Tav is a symbol of final perfection, final truth, what is whole at the end. It's not until the end of our lease on this earth that we're going to see predators eating straw like an ox or like a donkey. In the millennial kingdom, you will see that. But until that time, I doubt if you're going to see a lion or a wolf eating much straw. It's just not supposed to happen yet. It's not part of the plan for this time. And then Ezekiel chapter 9, we see that Hashem orders the angel Gabriel to put a tav, the letter tav, on the foreheads of the citizens of Jerusalem, so that he can distinguish between the righteous and the unrighteous. This is an end time prophecy. This is a judgment of the end, not of the beginning. Tav comes at the end. The tav stands for tichayeh. Tichayeh. You shall live. When it comes time for marks, you want the tav, the tichayeh. You shall live. Any other mark you're probably not interested in. But since it represents ultimate divine perfection, what we have to understand that our perfection, man's perfection, will not precede the work of the sun. You see, in this case, in the straw, perfection comes before the sun. It can't do that in us. We're people. We're human. His perfection comes before us. And that's why the straw is not clean for a tithe. In fact, if you add a tav to a Hebrew verb, what you're doing, you're forming it into a future action, into a future tense. Tav is at the end, not at the beginning. That's why we distinguish Evan from Lavan from Tevin. Everything has to be in the proper order. The proper use for Tevin right now is fodder for camels and donkeys. It's not for us to make bricks to idols, to make a name for ourselves, to reach into the heavens. To take straw and make bricks for man-made monuments. That's just a substitute, because the perfection is found in the stones of the temple. It's found in the Temple Mount. Now let's go a little deeper. I know that wasn't very deep. Let's go back to the prophet Yirmiyahu, where we read. And I want to point out to you a little section of it that pertains very much to our building from the Father verse. In Jeremiah 23:28 it says, "The prophet who has a dream may relate his dream, but let him who has my word speak my word in truth." That was the word that came forth this morning. That confirms to me that maybe I was on the right track with this. Let him who has my word speak my word in truth. What does straw have in common with grain, declares the Lord? That's an interesting question. When I first read it, I did not know. I had to continue studying to find out what it does have in common with grain. What does straw have in common with grain, declares the Lord? Then he goes on to explain it for us. He's very good about explaining things for us. Is not my word like a fire, declares the Lord, and like a hammer which shatters a rock? Now that's not the Evan rock. That's a different Hebrew word for rock, so don't think he's contradicting himself. He's not. Therefore, behold, I am against the prophets, declares the Lord, who steal my words from each other, nor do they furnish the people the slightest benefit. How many prophets or so-called prophets today do you know that steal words from one another but not from the Word of God? How many people have read Hal Lindsey's books and become end-time prophets? They just stole the words from each other. They didn't go back to the Word. They didn't use sound interpretive principles from the Torah of truth and from the Nevi'im, from the prophets who explain that truth for you, and from the Brit Hadashah, which will elaborate upon that truth. They didn't do that. They simply took words and interpretations from one another and never learned how to apply interpretive principles so that they would know what the truth is. They're just writing books based on other books that a man wrote. When you study, don't take a book's word for it. When I speak, don't take my word for it. You go to the truth and you find out if it's matching up. That's why it's important for you to know how to interpret the Scripture just as much as any teacher that stands up here, because we could tell you wrong. If you're human, you have an agenda, I'm sorry. And sometimes you warp the words to fit that agenda. As hard as you try not to, you still do it. So always go to the truth, go to the Torah, and match what you're hearing or reading against what the truth actually is. And that is the defining statement, I believe, of this passage. What does straw have in common with grain? Well, we know straw and grain are the same plant, right? You've got the stalk that comes up, then you've got the heads of grain. Once they mature, the nutritious part of it, at least for a human being, is harvested off. But what's left, the hay or the straw, is really only fit for animals. That's the part that is exempt from the tithe. But the grain, the clean part, the nutritious part, the part that will sustain you, the part that can become your bread of life, that is brought into the temple. That is sacrificed. And we use the straw to tinder the fire in which we roast the grain to offer it as first fruits, and as tinder to bake the bread that comes from the grain. So what does straw have in common with grain? The straw is the chaff. It's the falsity of the man-made systems, the imitation systems. Yes, it's the same plant, but they have much different uses. And by ordering the Israelites to find their own straw for the bricks, what he's doing, he's saying, go steal from my own people. You steal from my people. Remember, if we read the passage closely a couple of weeks ago, it said not only did Pharaoh order Hebrew babies to be killed, but he ordered all the babies to be killed. And then we find out from the Mishnah that the reason for that order was because his astrologers had told him that a baby was being born who would supplant his kingdom. So he said, kill them all. And then we find that pictured again in the Brit Hadashah when Herod orders all the babies killed. You don't notice it because it's so small. But we have to pay attention to small things. But he is ordering the Hebrews to steal from his own people in order to build his system, to fulfill his decrees. They're stealing from the beasts of the field in order to build a monument, a storehouse for Pharaoh. In the same way, Yirmiyahu says false prophets steal words from one another. They're not even yours to begin with. They belong to someone else, but you're going to go out and steal them in order to build this monument to a human being. These false prophets steal words that are not the word of truth after they have been filtered through many false prophets. And I think there's a lot of religious, economic, political systems that would require us to scavenge throughout the kingdom in order to build their man-made cities and storehouses. And they would like for us to build up Pharaoh's house instead of the temple. They would like for us to steal from the very beasts of the field, who, after all, they're content with the false word of the prophets. They'll just eat the straw. That's all they require. But they would even have us go steal from them in order to build a religious, economic, political monument to their system. Those words that we steal, that straw, the false words of the prophets, it has no sustaining power for us. It's going to blow away in the first wind. It's not nutritious. These prophets, these false prophets, have ignored the bread of life. They've ignored the living Torah, and it is only that will sustain us and give us the nutrition that we need. In Luke 12:15, Yeshua's teaching, I believe, about this concept. And he said unto them, "Take heed, and beware of covetousness. For a man's life consists not in the abundance of the things which he possesses." And he spake a parable unto them, saying, The ground of a certain rich man brought forth plentifully. And he thought within himself, saying, What shall I do, because I have no room where to bestow my fruits? And he said, This will I do. I will pull down my barns, my storehouses, and build greater, and there will I bestow all my fruits and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, thou hast much goods laid up for many years. Take thine ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said unto him, Thou fool, this night thy soul shall be required of thee. Then whose things shall these be, which thou hast provided? So is he that layeth up treasure for himself, and is not rich toward God. This is what Yeshua is teaching. The monuments we build to ourselves, the goods that we cram into the storehouse to perpetuate either our own kingdom or the kingdom of a Pharaoh or a Lavan. If we are so foolish as to think that we can keep those treasures in that storehouse, then he says, You fool, your soul will be required of you. And then, where will your goodies be? Who will have those? It's covetousness that motivates Lavan. It's covetousness that motivates Paro, so that he oppresses people to build his kingdom. Yeshua is telling us about pride, covetousness, presumption. Ananias and Sapphira could tell us a little bit about presumption. That was motivating this landlord to build new barns instead of to pour out his blessing upon the poor and upon the Levites of his time. If you refuse to acknowledge that your prosperity comes from Hashem, then he will take it from you and he will give it to someone else. In the long run, it will go to the Levite and it will go to the poor where it belongs. Don't think that you have acquired these things by your own hand, because you have not. You have acquired these things because of the blessing of Hashem. And he will give and he will take away. The storehouses of Israel, though, were so much different from the storehouses of Paro, and from the covetous rich man that Yeshua talks about. Because the storehouses of Israel, those are the result of dedicating your first fruits. The best that you have, the grain, what is clean, holy, and pure. That you have dedicated that blessing that he gave you back so that you can continue the service of the Levitical priesthood, to maintain the temple, so that those who serve in the temple and who study and serve before you can continue to serve into the temple. And you're building your house upon a rock, not upon sand. When you do that, you're ensuring that there is bread in the temple, that there is bread in the body of Messiah. You see, it's a completely different purpose for the righteous when they bring the tithe into the storehouse. They are not doing it to build huge buildings and monuments and names. They're doing it to fulfill the scripture, to give to the poor, to open your hand to the needy, to do better for those who have drawn the short straws of our generation. Now back to Paro's short straws. Now tevin, stalks of the chopped up part of the chaff, that can also be tevin, in addition to the actual straw itself. The complete straw can also be stubble. The tevin, like I said, is mentioned a total of 8 times in context, one right after the other, so it's no accident. It's not coincidental. What that's pointing you to is circumcision. Remember also in the Torah portion, Zipporah says, "You're a bloody bridegroom to me because of the circumcision." And then following hard on the heels of that statement, we see the straw appearing 8 times, referring to the 8th day on which circumcision occurs. So you have a shade, or you have an allusion there to the circumcision. And we know now, because we've used our interpretive principles, that the straw or the tevin represents a refusal to speak or to hear the truth, the true word of God. It's the opposite of tevin, uncircumcision, is the opposite of the circumcision of the heart. That process of learning to hear the truth, like Yaakov did in Lavan's house with the lamed, learning, teaching, instruction. It's learning to hear the truth, the uncompromised, unfiltered, unedited Torah of truth, and not only to hear it, but to respond to it from your heart. That's circumcision of the heart. That is the opposite of the straw of falsehood, that poor substitute for the grain that's really only fit for a beast of burden. And Paro, when he's confronted by Moshe and Aharon, he does not recognize his own falsehood. He doesn't see what he's doing. Remember Monday night Bible study, I told you denial stands for don't even know I'm lying? You don't. He's in denial. He does not even know how far away from the truth that he is. His heart is uncircumcised. He cannot distinguish the truth from a lie. He cannot tell the straw from the grain. And then he accuses the Hebrews of listening to lies, when he's the one that's lying. So the enemy's always going to accuse you of the very thing he's doing, because he's the father of lies. That's one of his techniques. But because Pharaoh refused to remove that veil of flesh from his heart and to be sensitive to the Holy Spirit, instead of feeding the poor of Egypt, instead of relieving the oppression of the Israelites, he instead says, they're lying, they're listening to lies, they've got too much free time, work them harder. He's not using his storehouses to feed those people or to minimize their oppression. You see, the original storehouses of Egypt were built by Yosef. Ironically, they are built by a Hebrew in service of a previous Paro. But see, those storehouses were built as the result of God-given dreams and God-given instructions. That's why we read the passage in Jeremiah where it talks about, oh, dream to dream. Well, sure you have. You're dreaming of big stuff for yourself. That's what your dream is. But the original, the true, not the substitute, the true storehouse was built to keep the Near Eastern world alive during a time of severe famine. Those were storehouses for the poor. That was the design purpose of them. And they did. They saved the Near Eastern world from starvation. They were the salvation of Israel and his sons. But the storehouses that this Pharaoh is building are not built on God-given dreams and God-given interpretations and God-given advice. It's built out of the pride of his own uncircumcised heart. The prophets that are advising him are wanting to profit from this system. That's why they continue to prophesy lies. They wanted to use Israelite slave labor, and they wanted to use Egyptian straw to build these monuments, to perpetuate this religious, economic, political system in place. You know, it's no accident that later in the Torah, when we're given instructions about how we are to treat a goy slave or a fellow Israelite servant, the instruction is always ended with a command, not a suggestion, but a command to remember the oppression that we suffered in Egypt. That's what he's talking about. We are to remember this right here when we learn, when we are instructed in the Torah of how we're to treat people who are also in hard conditions, drawing the short straw, whether you're a goy, slave, or whether you're an Israelite servant, we are to remember how to treat you based on how we were treated. Whether we were mistreated as an Egyptian peasant, being robbed of our straw, or whether we were a Hebrew being forced to make bricks without the straw. Now, one of the storehouse cities that Paro built was called Ramses, which has no Hebrew equivalent. But if I were to spell out the words for you on the board, you would see that there's two distinct words in there. There's Ra'am, which means thunder, and there's Sus, which is horse. You put the two words together and you have a thundering horse if you simply look at the letters. And you remember the Song of the Sea where Miriam's singing, she says, some trust in chariots, some trust in horses, thundering horses, but we will remember the name of the Lord our God. Paro was trusting in his storehouse cities, his own monuments, his own goods, just like the rich man says, I got to tear down these barns and get some bigger ones. That's the heart that Pharaoh has. He did not remember the name. When Moshe and Aharon says, we've come in this name, I don't know that name. He should have known that name. I'm sure it was in the Egyptian archives. It hadn't been that long since they knew the name and they delivered not only Egypt, but the surrounding countries from starvation. The name was somewhere. Pharaoh had not studied. He had not studied and done his homework. His magicians, his prophets, his advisors had not studied. They had not done their homework, and they didn't know the name. So they trusted in their storehouses. But the Hebrews, when they were delivered at the sea, they said, some trust in chariots, some trust in horses, but we remember the name and we're delivered. We're not trusting in these storehouses and these man-made monuments that are built. There's no way in the world your thundering horses can match the power of Elohim when he makes up his mind to deliver his people. It can't stand. But the Egyptian city Pithom, which is the first there that I wrote on the board for you, it's spelled with a Peh, Tav, Mem Sofit. Now there's no real Hebrew equivalent to this word. It's just the name of a city. But if you match it to the Hebrew word Pithom, which is actually pronounced the same, Pithom, it means suddenly in Hebrew. If I say Pithom, it's suddenly something happened. Notice that in the Hebrew word Pithom, there is an aleph that does not exist in the Egyptian city. What is that telling you? Because you know that the aleph represents Elohim, the creative power of the Almighty. What Pharaoh was doing was building cities, Pithom, without the creative power of Elohim in his life. It won't work. It won't last. It won't be sustained without the name. He had forgotten the name and he left the aleph out of Pithom. That's what that's telling you. Also, with the thundering horses, which I did a little bit of teaching on this at Sukkot, I didn't have time to really elaborate on it. We talked about Ramses and the thundering horses and then how it represented Esau, and then we read from Job. But in the time that we're reading from, all the way to the time of Shlomo, all the way up until today, as of right now, the Egyptian Arab horse is the most prized among all horses. There's different strains, but the Egyptian strain of the Arab is the most prized. They say it's the origin of all other breeds of horses. All other warm-blooded horses have that strain in them. They have much stamina, much beauty. If you have seen pictures of Saddam Hussein on the news where he's riding that white horse, that is an Arabian. And that has distinctive Egyptian Arabian features. You can tell the difference if you know the horse. Very distinct, most highly prized. But even the most highly prized of horses cannot match the creative power of Elohim. We cannot depend upon the mud, the mire, and the straw to build our buildings, because those are artificial. It's an artificial challenge to heaven that says we're going to make a name for ourselves. We're going to leave your name out of our cities. We're going to trust in our thundering horses. You know, it says not only did they take bricks for stone or bricks for Evan, it also says that they took slime and mud for mortar. What did Yeshua tell us about a pig that you clean up? Goes straight back to the mud. See that three little pigs thing? It doesn't work. A pig is a pig is a pig. By any other name, a pig is a pig. We should not be pigs. We should not wallow in the mud and the mire and attempt to build our cities with mortar of mud. He delivered us from the mud. Let's get out of that. Don't return to those false systems of Pharaoh. Now, the lesson of the grain versus the straw, or the brick versus the stone to build the storehouses and the temple. You know, it's always been an Israelite's job to build the temple. Even before there was a temple at the Song of the Sea, if we were to continue reading today, there's reference after reference after reference to the temple place, to the place where He will put His name that we will not forget. Before the Torah is given at Sinai, they know that they are to build the temple out of stone. And then Paul, he midrashes on this a little bit in the portion that we read from 1 Corinthians 3:9. I'm going to read it again. He says, "For we are God's fellow workers. You are God's field and God's building." Are you going to be His straw and His stone? Are you going to be His bricks? You're going to be His wood? You're going to be His precious metal, His gold? What are you going to be? You are God's field and His building. According to the grace of God which was given to me, like a wise master builder, I laid a foundation, and another is building on it. But each man must be careful how he builds on it. We have to be very careful what we're building with. This is a caution. For no man can lay a foundation other than the one which is laid, which is Yeshua HaMashiach. The living Torah is the foundation of stone, because He is in the Evan. He is the Son. Now if any man builds on the foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw. And I'm going to stop right here. Do you see the declining value of the things that Paul is listing here? He starts out with gold, which is the best, and silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw. We have our choice what to build with, but there is a declining progression in what he's listing. What is he saying to us? The first three items, gold, silver, precious stones, if we build with those things, those will endure fire. If I set fire to them, they won't burn up. They might discolor, clean them up a little bit, but they're still fine. But if I build with wood, hay, and straw, and a really hot fire gets touched to them, they're gone. The wood, the hay, and the straw will not last through that refining fire. Now he continues, each man's work will become evident, for the day will show it, because it is to be revealed with fire. At the point where you realize there's a fire, and all I've done is build me a house of straw or wood, you're going to have a really bad feeling. If you realize you've been working for Pharaoh, when the fire comes, that's a sinking feeling. It says it will be revealed with fire, and the fire itself will test the quality of each man's work. If any man's work which he has built on, it remains, he will receive a reward. If any man's work is burned up, he will suffer loss, but he himself will be saved, yet so as through fire. You're going to have a smell on you. You're going to be charcoal. But he says you'll still be saved. If you've been building for Pharaoh, I guess there's still hope. Do you not know that you are a temple of God and that the Spirit of God dwells in you? If any man destroys the temple of God, God will destroy him. For the temple of God is holy, and that is what you are. You are the grain that is clean. You are the grain that is to be tithed from. And I believe that this grain sitting in this building today is the first fruits. of the grain. You are the first fruits of the huge harvest that will come in later. Somebody has to go first. That's why we're looking at each other saying, are we the only people that act like this or think like this? No, you're just the first fruits. You're going first. You are a field of grain. You are a holy building built with stone and precious things, not with wood, hay, and stubble that will be burned up. It says, so Yisrael will gather, which are the grains, to Jerusalem that is built on the mountain of Hashem, as it is written. Who shall ascend into the mountain of Hashem? Or who stand in his holy place? He that has clean hands and a pure heart. If you're the grain, you're clean. If you've got that circumcised heart 8 times, you've got the circumcised heart, you're pure. You see, the grain has to be separated from the chaff, from the straw, because you don't even tithe off of the straw. We could talk about that for about a month, probably. That we could read through Ezekiel and talk a long time about separating the grain from the straw and what that means in the millennium. But we're also a holy building. We're not going to build this building with false words. We're not going to steal the words of other people. But we're going to build what we build upon the pure, uncompromised, unedited word of truth. Like it says in Ezekiel 44, thus saith the Lord God, no stranger, uncircumcised in heart, nor uncircumcised in flesh shall enter into my sanctuary of any stranger that is among the children of Israel. You know what? There's going to be a mixed multitude that goes up with us. But if they're uncircumcised in flesh and heart, they're not going into the temple. I'm sorry. There's rules. You must be the grain. You cannot be the straw. You must be the stone. You cannot be the brick. I didn't write it. I'm sorry. But Paul is cautioning us not to be like Pharaoh. Not to build houses of straw and mud and brick. Monuments to ourselves, to make a name for ourselves, where we're going to put our faith in those monuments to ourselves. Because after it's all tested with fire, all that stuff is burned up. Even the brick won't make it through the fire. It's not mentioned as something that will make it. Because it has straw as the thing holding it together. Only the things that you brought forth out of the good treasure of your heart, the precious stones, the precious metals, the gold and the silver, that's what will endure the fire. And it's not going to be burned. I'm going to conclude with a passage from Nahum chapter 3. Nahum chapter 3. It says, woe to the bloody city, completely full of lies and pillage. The noise of the whip, the noise of the rattling of the wheel, galloping horses and bounding chariots, horsemen charging, swords flashing, spears gleaming, many slain, a mass of corpses, and countless dead bodies. They stumble over the dead bodies, all because of the many harlotries of the harlot, the charming one, the mistress of sorceries, who sells nations by her harlotries. Behold, I am against you, declares the Lord of hosts, and I will lift up your skirts over your face and show to the nations your nakedness. Y'all remember what nakedness is? It means your covenant is damaged. You have no covenant relationship in good standing. He will expose those who have departed from the covenant. I will set you up as a spectacle, and it will come about that all who see you will shrink from you and say, Nineveh is devastated. Are you better than Noamon, which was situated by the waters of the Nile, with water surrounding her? Ethiopia was her might, and Egypt too, without limits. Yet she became an exile. She went into captivity, and all her great men were bound with fetters. You too will become drunk. You will be hidden. You too will search for a refuge from the enemy. All your fortifications are fig trees with ripe fruit. When shaken, they fall into the eater's mouth. The gates of your land are opened wide to your enemies. Fire consumes your gate bars. Draw for yourself water for the siege. Strengthen your fortifications. Go into the clay and tread the mortar. Take hold of the brick mold. There, fire will consume you. The sword will cut you down. It will consume you as the locust. Did you hear the taunting? We don't think of Elohim as taunting people, but he is taunting those who have inherited the spirit of Egypt and Nineveh in this passage. He said, go ahead, go on into the brick molds. You think brick will last, little pig? It won't. It won't stand. He says, the fire will consume you and the sword will cut you down. Don't put your trust in that brick mold. Get out of Pharaoh's house. When the deliverance is offered, run. Get out of that system. You want to prepare for siege and for fire? Don't be like a brick and look like every other brick that came from that mold. You got to break out of that mold. I'm sorry. You're going to be a unique treasure. You're going to be peculiar looking. You know, no two diamonds look the same, really. Because they're unique. The way they were created, they were rocks that were compressed under much pressure. And once you hit those certain points, they split different ways and they look different. You won't be little stamps, little bricks out of the same mold. You'll be something precious with that circumcised heart that's sensitive to the Torah of truth, that does not listen to the false words of the prophets that have been stolen. We know how to prepare for a siege, and it's with the Torah of truth. Mama and Papa lied to you about the little pigs. Get away from the brick houses. The Israelites in the Torah portion had to scatter all over Egypt, it says, in order to find their straw. And I think we've also been scattered all over the world in order to build and collect straw for a system, whether it's political, economic, or religious. And it's up to us to recognize our day of deliverance and to get out, to quit serving the pharaohs of our generation. They want you to make the bricks and build their own storehouses. But they have forgotten the name. They don't know the name. It slipped away from them because they don't study to show themselves approved. When we bring our tithes into the storehouse, it's so that those in our generation who have drawn the short straws can benefit from our blessing. And there can be food in His house, that His word can continue to go forth, that there can be service in the temple, and that those who have drawn the short straws, there's food for them, whether it's physical bread brought into the storehouse, or whether it's the bread of life, the Torah of truth that will sustain them and be their nutrition. They're tired of eating straw, guys. They're sick of straw. They need something good. They need a hot loaf of bread. And you've got it. You've got that Torah of truth in your circumcised heart.
If you'd like a copy of this program or are interested in starting your own Messianic congregation, please write to the Olive Branch, Highway 80 East at Sally's Branch Road, London, Kentucky 40744, or phone us at 606-862-0878, or visit our website at theolivebranchonline.com.